The Arctic doesn't forgive curiosity. It only tolerates it for a while. Beneath its endless white horizon lies the kind of silence that makes a man forget his own heartbeat, a silence older than war, older than memory. And yet, in 1959, the United States Army decided to disturb it. They called their mission Camp Century. To the world, it was a scientific outpost built to test survival under ice. In truth, it was something stranger, a frozen city, carved for both progress and paranoia. At the height of the Cold War, America's imagination was boundless. If they could split atoms and reach space, why not conquer the Arctic? The logic seemed sound at the Pentagon. The shortest route for a Soviet missile to reach the United States was over the North Pole. So the best way to defend against that threat, or to prepare for their own strike, was to plant a foothold right beneath it. Greenland, an island of ice 3 times the size of Texas, offered the perfect cover. Its surface was uninhabitable, its interior untouched. No city could be built there unless you buried it. The plan came from the Army Corps of Engineers, men who had built bridges over impossible rivers and airfields on islands made of coral. They were told to build a base inside the ice, a place where hundreds of soldiers could live, work, and if necessary, fight a war from under the snow. The Danish government, which technically owned Greenland, gave permission for scientific research. The United States nodded politely and began designing a labyrinth. They chose a spot on the northwest ice sheet, 150 miles inland from the coast, a place so remote that even polar bears gave up halfway there. Supplies had to be hauled in by giant snowcats, diesel-powered tractors dragging trainloads of cargo across frozen emptiness. The journey took days. The first team to arrive found a landscape so flat it disoriented the eyes. The horizon offered no point of reference, just a vast sheet of light that erased depth. The air was sharp enough to draw blood from a man's nose just by breathing. When the first shovels bit into the snow, the wind swallowed the sound. Work in the Arctic isn't measured in hours but in layers. 1 foot of snow cleared, 2 feet cut, the endless repetition of motion against the elements. The men worked in heavy parkas and masks, their breath crystallizing into tiny halos. They built wooden frames, covered them with metal sheets, and used giant snow-cutting saws to carve tunnels wide enough for trucks. Each tunnel was reinforced, then buried again beneath the snow. The result looked like a series of trenches from a war fought by ghosts. They called it the city under the ice. It had everything a city needed: barracks, a chapel, laboratories, a communication center, even a barbershop. Fluorescent lights buzzed against the cold ceiling. Pipes carried heated water through the snow, radiating warmth like veins in a body. The men slept in bunks under wool blankets while 30 feet of ice groaned above them. They learned to recognize each creak and crack the way sailors recognize the sound of waves. To power this underground experiment, the Army brought something extraordinary: a portable nuclear reactor. Shipped in pieces and assembled inside a reinforced tunnel, it was called PM-2A. The reactor glowed at the heart of Camp Century, a warm mechanical sun buried in darkness. It hummed constantly, its turbines spinning life into the frozen city. For the first time in history, nuclear energy powered a town inside a glacier. The newspapers back home called it a miracle of modern engineering. But miracles have maintenance schedules. The ice was not static, it moved, flowed, breathed. What seemed solid was, in truth, a slow ocean of frozen motion. Each day, the tunnel shifted by fractions of an inch. Doors jammed, walls bowed, beams bent under invisible pressure. The engineers fought the ice like an enemy, patching, reinforcing, carving anew. They told themselves it was manageable. Progress always sounds like reassurance when spoken aloud. The soldiers at Camp Century called themselves iceworms. They lived by routines designed to keep the mind from freezing before the body did. Every morning began with coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. Every night ended with a hum, the constant mechanical lullaby of generators and pumps. Letters from home arrived weeks late, their ink smudged by condensation. Some men dreamed of warmth so vividly they woke sweating under their parkas. Others started naming the tunnels after streets from their hometowns, as if to remind themselves that cities still existed somewhere without ceilings of snow. There were scientists too, meteorologists, geologists, glaciologists. They drilled ice cores and measured temperatures, mapping the ancient history trapped in frozen layers. Every borehole was a time machine, each foot of ice a year's worth of snowfall preserved like memory. They discovered pollen from distant continents, volcanic ash from forgotten eruptions. To them, the Arctic was a library. But the Army had other books it wanted to read. Officially, Camp Century was part of Operation Icecap, a peaceful research initiative studying polar conditions. Unofficially, it was a cover for something called Project Iceworm. The real mission, to test whether nuclear missiles could be hidden under Greenland's ice, thousands of them, spread across a vast frozen network invisible to Soviet satellites. In theory, the missiles would be mobile, their tunnels constantly shifting to avoid detection. It would make the entire ice sheet a living launch platform, a frozen arsenal stretching across an area the size of France. The logic was chillingly simple. If the enemy couldn't find your weapons, they couldn't destroy them first. The Arctic, blank and silent, would become the ultimate deterrent. But no one asked the ice for permission. By 1960, Camp Century housed over 200 men. Their days blurred together. Endless maintenance, endless drills, endless darkness. The surface above was a wasteland of white dunes and brutal winds. Temperatures could plunge below -70 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds. The tunnels below provided refuge, but not comfort. Humidity built up, frost formed on walls, and the air tasted faintly metallic from the generators. The base doctor treated frostbite, insomnia, and an unnameable malaise the men called ice fever, a mixture of isolation and dread. To break the monotony, the Army sent film crews and journalists. They filmed men playing cards, reading magazines, attending chapel. They showed smiling scientists taking temperature readings and soldiers jogging under fluorescent light. The footage became a propaganda reel. The city under the ice, proof of American ingenuity. Back home, families watched it in theaters and marveled. Few realized that the smiles were forced, that the city creaked under strain, that every surface hid condensation like sweat. The engineers soon learned that the ice was not the stable foundation they'd imagined. It shifted unpredictably, deforming tunnels faster than they could repair them. Walls buckled inward, ceilings sagged. The nuclear reactor, though stable, produced heat that softened the surrounding snow. The base began to sink by millimeters each month. The men joked that the city was slowly being swallowed by the world it tried to conquer. Still, the scientists pressed on. They drilled deeper cores, mapped wind patterns, and conducted experiments on human endurance. They sent data to universities and reports to Washington. Each success papered over a growing list of structural failures. Then, in 1962, a classified assessment reached the Pentagon. The ice was moving too fast, the tunnels were collapsing faster than they could be rebuilt, and any future missile network beneath Greenland would be unsustainable. The report buried Project Iceworm before it ever launched. The plan to hide 600 nuclear missiles under the Arctic was quietly shelved. The official reason was cost. The real one was nature. The ice had won. Camp Century lingered on as a research station, stripped of its secret ambition. The soldiers left, replaced by smaller teams of scientists. By 1967, the base was abandoned entirely. The nuclear reactor was dismantled and removed, or at least, most of it. Fuel rods were shipped back to the U.S., but the cooling fluids, waste, and contaminated materials were left behind, buried under tons of snow. The Army assumed they'd stay there forever, frozen in time. No one imagined the ice would one day melt. For decades, Camp Century disappeared from memory, entombed beneath drifting snow. The ice swallowed every tunnel, every lab, every barracks, compressing them into silence. It was as if the Cold War had tried to build a city inside a grave. When satellite technology improved in the 21st century, researchers rediscovered its location. What they found was not a ruin, but a warning. Climate models showed that rising global temperatures were melting Greenland's ice faster than predicted, fast enough that Camp Century's remains could resurface within decades. And with them would come the toxic legacy of its hidden history: diesel fuel, sewage, and radioactive coolant. What had been buried for safety might one day poison the very world it sought to protect. But that reckoning was still in the future. Back in 1960, none of the men inside Camp Century could imagine their creation becoming a ghost. To them, it was the frontier, a triumph of technology, proof that even the Arctic could be colonized. They didn't know they were writing the prologue to a fable about arrogance. Outside, the northern lights shimmered across the sky, silent and indifferent. Beneath them, a city hummed, a miracle of steel and radiation, of human defiance wrapped in permafrost. The men slept, trusting that the ice would hold. And for a time, it did. But nothing in the Arctic stands still forever. When a city dies, it usually leaves ruins. Camp Century left pressure ridges. The tunnels that had once echoed with laughter and machinery began to deform like veins closing under a pulse. Engineers called it plastic flow, but the word plastic didn't do it justice. The ice was alive, restless, grinding. Every day, walls bowed another inch. Doors that had opened easily a week ago required crowbars. Ceilings sagged until men had to crouch to pass through. It was like living inside a slow-motion avalanche. Above ground, the Arctic sun kept its strange rhythm, months of endless light followed by months of darkness. Beneath it, the buried base sweated and groaned. The nuclear reactor continued to hum, pumping warmth into the frozen earth and accelerating the ice's rebellion. Each adjustment the engineers made to counter it only postponed the inevitable. Camp Century was fighting physics, and physics always wins. The men who stayed longest spoke later of strange noises at night, deep booms echoing through the tunnels like heartbeats. Sometimes, entire sections of ceiling would fracture in silence, then drop suddenly with a roar, burying equipment in glittering shards. There was no fire to fear, only collapse. They patched what they could, but the glacier's weight was patient. Every fix was temporary. The base was dissolving around them. By 1964, Camp Century looked less like a triumph of engineering and more like an archaeological site, a ruin that hadn't yet died. The Americans kept sending supplies, still hoping the data gathered by the scientists would justify the cost. The glaciologists drilled deeper than ever before, reaching ice that predated human civilization. They extracted cores containing trapped air bubbles, time capsules of ancient atmospheres. Those samples would later prove invaluable to climate science, revealing carbon dioxide levels from hundreds of thousands of years ago. Ironically, the base that would one day threaten the planet's environment also gave humanity its first clear picture of how fragile that environment truly was. But for the soldiers and engineers still stationed there, science was a thin consolation. The daily reports grew grim. Tunnel deformation increasing. Roof sag measured at 18 inches. Reactor exhaust port compromised. The ice was closing in faster than calculations predicted. The Army's optimism turned to unease. The official line from Washington was that Camp Century would continue as a permanent research station. The men on the ground knew better. Permanent was a word for maps, not for ice. They began dismantling what they could salvage, shipping out equipment, and sealing what they couldn't. In 1967, after less than a decade of operation, the last group shut down the generators, switched off the lights, and left. The nuclear reactor was disassembled and flown out in pieces. Everything else, diesel fuel, waste, machinery, hundreds of thousands of liters of coolant water contaminated with radiation, was left behind, frozen into the glacier like artifacts sealed in amber. They didn't leave markers. There was no point. The wind would erase any trace within days. Snowfall would bury it within weeks. By the time the first blizzard rolled across the site, Camp Century had vanished completely. From the air, there was nothing but the same endless, featureless white. The lost city of the Cold War had gone to sleep under its own ceiling. The world moved on. The nuclear race shifted from Arctic experiments to space-based surveillance, submarine deterrence, and intercontinental missiles hidden in plains and deserts. Greenland returned to being a blank spot on the map. Its secret base became a ghost story told among veterans and engineers, the time we tried to live inside a glacier. Officially, the files were classified, buried like the camp itself. For decades, nothing disturbed the site except the wind. The ice sheet thickened, pressing down with ancient patience. The tunnels collapsed inward, crushing steel and timber, compressing rooms until desks and chairs fused into fossil-like impressions. The air trapped inside those chambers condensed into high-pressure pockets. Somewhere in the dark, barrels of fuel and waste sat intact, preserved by cold that seemed eternal. Then the world began to warm. In the late 1990s, climate scientists returned to Greenland to drill new cores. They used radar to map layers of ice, and in the data, they saw something strange. Anomalies buried hundreds of feet below the surface, shapes that didn't match natural formations. The coordinates matched the long-lost location of Camp Century. Curiosity replaced myth. Researchers began reconstructing what had been left behind, piecing together military documents that had long since been declassified. What they found shocked them. The U.S. Army's own estimates revealed that the site contained over 200,000 liters of diesel fuel, 240,000 liters of wastewater, tons of toxic chemicals, and a thin residue of radioactive material from the reactor's cooling system, all sealed beneath the snow in 1967. At the time, the Army assumed the waste would remain entombed forever. The assumption was simple: ice doesn't melt. But the models had changed. Greenland's ice sheet was thinning faster than anyone predicted. In 2016, a team from the University of York published a report warning that the remains of Camp Century could resurface within decades. Melting, they wrote, could release those chemicals into meltwater streams, contaminating the environment and potentially reaching the ocean. The same base once hailed as the city under the ice was now labeled a toxic time bomb. The irony was breathtaking. The Cold War's dream of technological control had backfired not with an explosion, but with a slow, planetary sigh. The city built to hide nuclear weapons might end up poisoning the world through climate change, the unintended weapon of the next century. In Denmark, the revelation caused outrage. Greenland had long resented the secrecy of Camp Century. Now it faced the consequences of a deal it had never truly agreed to. The Danish parliament demanded explanations. The United States, caught off guard, promised cooperation but avoided responsibility. Treaties didn't anticipate melting glaciers. Legally, the ice was still Denmark's, but morally, it belonged to history. For the scientists studying the site, the story was both fascinating and horrifying. Camp Century had become an accidental experiment in deep-time engineering, a test of how long human ambition could survive inside nature's oldest system. The results were clear. Not long. Every machine rusted, every wall collapsed, every secret thawed eventually. In 2017, a joint American-Danish expedition returned to the site to take samples. The landscape had changed completely. Where the glacier once rose smooth and endless, it now bore crevices and melt channels. The camp's exact position was still hidden beneath 35 meters of ice, but radar showed that meltwater was beginning to pool above it. One day, that water will reach the tunnels. One day, the city will rise again, not as steel, but as pollution. For now, the Arctic still keeps its secrets, but the clock is ticking faster than before. Scientists estimate that by the end of this century, much of northwestern Greenland's ice could thin enough to expose Camp Century's remains. If that happens, the world will face a question no one expected to ask: who cleans up a Cold War buried in ice? Even in its disappearance, Camp Century remains a mirror. It reflects everything the Cold War believed about itself: the faith in technology, the disregard for consequence, the conviction that anything built by man could outlast time. The men who dug those tunnels didn't mean to endanger the future. They simply believed the future was frozen. Yet nature, patient and exacting, has been editing that assumption for decades. The Arctic's temperatures continue to climb. The permafrost that once locked away carbon, methane, and radioactive waste is softening. The ice that protected the past is melting into the present. The sins of the Cold War are seeping upward. When climate historians look back at the 20th century, they'll see that Camp Century marked a transition, the moment humanity stopped fearing what it could destroy and started discovering what it couldn't contain. The bomb made extinction quick, the ice made it slow. Both promised permanence. Both lied. Beneath the surface, the tunnels still exist in some ghostly form, compressed into distorted hollows, their timber ribs flattened, their machinery fossilized in frost. Sensors detect faint voids where the reactor chamber once stood, where the barracks once lined up like teeth in a jaw. If you could descend there now, you'd find no light, no air, just the memory of human warmth embedded in ice. And perhaps that's what makes Camp Century so haunting. It wasn't destroyed by war or sabotage or betrayal. It was undone by stillness, by the quiet persistence of a landscape that refused to be tamed. The men left thinking they conquered the Arctic. The Arctic waited until they were gone, then erased their footprints. The Arctic never forgets, it only delays. For half a century, Camp Century slept under its shroud of white, its remains compressed into the glacier like an unfinished sentence. Then the world warmed and the ice began to stir. The same human industry that built the frozen city had, decades later, awakened it again. Carbon rose, temperatures climbed, and the ice that had once been armor turned to water. It's a cruel symmetry. The Cold War built Camp Century out of fear of annihilation. The 21st century rediscovers it because we are still annihilating, only slower, more politely, through the chemistry of our own comfort. The bomb was loud, the melt is quiet. Satellite imagery now watches the same horizon that once watched us. Where engineers once imagined a fortress against nature, satellites see nature striking back. Greenland's ice sheet is retreating, its edges dissolving into blue pools that swallow light like mirrors of the sky. Somewhere under that brightness lies the base, the barracks, the reactor chamber, the tunnels warped by time. The men who lived there are gone, but their waste remains, sealed like a warning written in radiation and oil. Scientists call Camp Century a geopolitical ghost. Politicians call it a legacy issue. But what it really is, what it's always been, is a confession. It says, we thought we were building forever. We weren't. The story of Camp Century isn't about Greenland or even the Cold War. It's about the human fantasy of control, the idea that intelligence and machinery can outwit entropy. Every tunnel the Army built under that glacier was an act of defiance against time, an attempt to freeze history and live inside it. The men believed they were making a future immune to chaos. Instead, they built a monument to it. When you look at the photographs from 1959, it's easy to see why they believed. The pictures show neat corridors carved into ice, metal frames gleaming under fluorescent light, soldiers smiling beside the sign that read, "Welcome to Camp Century, the city under the ice." It looks orderly, even hopeful, as if the frontier had simply moved north. You can almost hear the hum of machinery and the low chatter of men believing they're part of something enduring. They didn't know they were living in an obituary written in advance. The base's reactor, the PM-2A, was supposed to power a century of progress. It lasted 8 years. Its waste will last thousands. When it was dismantled, the Army left behind what didn't fit into boxes: coolant, sludge, the debris of precision. They thought it would stay frozen forever. But forever is a word invented by people who haven't met geology. Today, every ton of carbon we release, every degree the planet warms, brings that hidden city closer to the surface. The Arctic melt is not just a climate crisis, it's an archaeological one. The Cold War buried its fears in ice, and now the ice is giving them back. It's as if the planet itself is declassifying history. There's a peculiar poetry in that the same ice cores drilled by Camp Century scientists to study the past now help us understand our future. The data they collected, those delicate columns of frozen air, each bubble a snapshot of ancient climate, became the foundation of modern climate science. Without Camp Century, we might not have known how fast we were warming. Without Camp Century, we might not have known that we were melting it awake. That irony would have pleased no one there. In the archives, there's a letter written by one of the soldiers stationed at Camp Century in 1961. He describes the sound of the reactor, a heartbeat I can hear through the floor. He writes about the strange comfort of routine, the way men tell jokes louder than they need to because laughter fills the silence faster than fear. And he ends with a line that feels almost prophetic. If the ice ever takes this place back, maybe it will remember we were here. It did. Every generation leaves its monuments. The Romans left marble, the Egyptians stone. The Cold War left radiation and plastic. But Camp Century stands apart because it was built to be invisible. Its builders wanted it forgotten, at least until it was needed. That's what makes it such a perfect symbol of its age, something designed to be permanent, erased by the very medium it depended on. You could call it tragic, But tragedy implies innocence. What Camp Century represents is not innocence lost, but arrogance uncovered. It's a story about the illusion of stability, the belief that a thing buried is a thing solved. Every vault leaks eventually, every secret becomes sediment. The ice that once hid our power now hides our pollution, and both are melting into the same ocean. As the glacier thins, it's tempting to imagine the moment when the tunnels finally collapse into daylight, when the world's first nuclear-powered ice city resurfaces. What will the sunlight find? Rust, perhaps. Shattered steel, warped barrels, the bones of machines. But also evidence of hope. Letters, signs, fragments of lives that believed in progress. A civilization trapped in mid-sentence. When future archaeologists dig there, they won't just find relics. They'll find a metaphor. They'll find proof that the greatest danger of the 20th century wasn't the bomb itself, but the conviction that we could bury its consequences. There's a term glaciologists use when describing the layers of an ice core: inclusions. It means whatever the snow captures as it falls: dust, pollen, ash, history. Camp Century is an inclusion now, a man-made fossil sealed in ice. The Arctic carries it the way the Earth carries bones, waiting for erosion to reveal them again. In that sense, Camp Century never truly ended. It was absorbed. The logic that created it, the faith in technology to make danger obsolete, survives everywhere. You can hear it in the language of modern defense, in the promises of AI, in the endless expansion of data centers and networks built to be fail-safe. Every generation thinks it's found a new way to outsmart decay. And every generation buries a little more of itself in the process. If the Cold War taught us anything, it's that victory and denial often look the same from above. In the photographs of Camp Century's closing, soldiers stand beside their packed crates, smiling faintly, squinting into the sun. Behind them, the entrance to the base is already half covered by drifting snow. Within days, it would be gone. They must have known that, but they also knew that erasure looks tidy on camera. History loves a clean ending. The truth is less cinematic. The truth is a hum beneath the ice, fading yet constant, a buried engine that still beats with radioactive heat. The base no longer exists, but the waste remains warm. The ground above it shifts, the ice sheet thins, and every few years a radar scan reveals that the ghosts have moved. Camp Century is a relic, yes, but it's also a rehearsal for the kind of future we keep building, one where innovation races ahead of wisdom, and the cleanup is left for someone else. The frozen city reminds us that technology can hide our fears for only so long before the weather changes and brings them home. Someday soon, the Arctic silence will break. The tunnels will flood, the metal will corrode, and the waste we buried in the name of progress will return to the surface. There will be debates, reports, committees. People will argue over who is responsible. But the ice won't care. The Arctic never negotiates, it only reveals. And when that revelation comes, it won't look like disaster. It will look like sunlight on meltwater. Beautiful, ordinary, unstoppable. Because in the end, the city under the ice was never about the Cold War. It was about us, about the part of humanity that keeps building things it cannot maintain, dreaming of permanence in a world that only offers change. Camp Century was our declaration of victory over nature. The melting ice is nature's reply. The lost city of the Cold War, inside the Greenland Ice Base, a city that tried to freeze time and thawed itself instead.